everyone, and thank you so much for joining our first session of Cherry Bekaert's New Markets Tax Credit Virtual Series. I see we have a lot of people joining from the Midwest, Northeast, East Coast, many great cities that you are representing today, and we look forward to you being here on our session. My name is Madeline Robbins, and I'm our production manager here at Cherry Bekaert. This virtual series is dedicated to community development organizations and companies that are interested in or currently involved in new markets tax credits. The series will provide a wealth of information and CPE at no charge per each of these sessions. Now, we hope you are planning to attend more throughout our series, and we will have those spaced out over the next several months. Here's some items to note before we get started. To receive CPE, you must answer at least 3 polling questions and attend for the full 50 minutes. Those CPE certificates will be issued via email within 10 days. If you have not received one after 10 days, go ahead and reach out to cbhlearning@cbh.com. We will also share a recorded version of the webinar. In about a week, it'll be posted to our website and shared via email. You can go back and view some of the slides within that recording as well. Now, if you have any questions during the webinar, locate that Q&A panel box down at the bottom. Type any questions you have for the team, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. A short survey will also be posted at the conclusion of the webinar. We value your feedback and just hope that you take part. With that, I'm going to pass it off to one of our speakers today for those introductions. So Margot, please take it away.
Hey, everybody. I'll do a quick intro here to start us off. I'm Margot Deloach, and I'm a Compliance and Asset Management Senior with Cherry Bekaert Strategic Financing Services Group. We also have Emma Wyatt, our CDE Program Manager with the Innovate Fund, and Scott Sheffey with our Project Financing team. I usually work with borrowers of the New Markets program after the deal closes, but today I'm going to be walking you guys through the basics of the program and the players involved. Next slide. So after the basics and the players, I'll hand it off to Emma to talk about CDE strategy, and then Scott Sheffey will talk about the projects themselves. All right, here we go. So the New Markets Tax Credit Program builds off the success of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which has been around since the 70s, and that helps finance the construction and rehab of rental housing at below market rents for low-income individuals. So the New Markets Program came about to create quality places to work and to build additional community assets for the low-income residents to enjoy. Since the year 2000, the NMTC program has improved access to capital for businesses across the nation in exchange for building their businesses in and hiring residents of urban and rural areas that have not experienced recent economic expansion. The NMTC program partners with entities with good community lending track records, and these are our community development entities that we'll talk about in a bit. They're really to help developers overcome some false perceptions of market risk and help to direct those capital investments towards low-income communities. The results of implementing the New Market Tax Credit Program is that we see projects who check these boxes become the most competitive in their search for funding. The CDE and investors are selecting their projects based on the significant community impact they provide, a demonstrated gap in financing, the size of the project, over $5 million, is really ideal for just how it's set up. And of course, the location of the project is big. Only certain census tracts across the country are eligible for NMTC funding. So that's racing through things. The first poll question, we'd love to maybe tailor our presentation a little bit to who's here today. So our first question is, where are you coming from today? Are you maybe a financial institution, community organization, or nonprofit? Are you from the business community, or maybe you're an economic development agency or others? Seconds more, I think. All right, we've got a good mix. That should give us a good idea of where to go going forward, Emma and Scott. All righty. So let's talk about the parties involved in a new markets transaction. First, we have the CDE, that is our community development entities. So they write applications annually to the CDFI fund, who is the keeper of the NMTC program. It's part of the US Treasury, and they work with the CDEs who apply for the allocation. This gets extremely competitive. This year we had about 200 CDEs submit applications, but only 107 received allocations. So each allocation is usually between $25 and $65 million. If they win, that allocation allows the CDE to turn around and sell that given amount of tax credits to an investor. The investor is going to be usually a large bank, Capital One, US Bank, PNC. They purchase the tax credits from the CDE, and they get to reduce their federal income tax liability by 39% of what they purchase. So the money paid by the investor is the equity investment. And then we have the leveraged lenders. So a key part of the NMTC program is that the investor equity only covers the financing gap we talked about earlier, about 30% of the total project cost. So this means that a project is responsible for sourcing the other 70% from a more traditional source, like commercial bank loans, equity from your parent company, grant proceeds, or donations. This 70% is known as the leverage. Then the CDE takes the equity investment from the investors and the leverage from that traditional source and passes the funding along to a qualified, active, low-income community business, what we call a Qualic B. Scott will break this acronym down later in the presentation for you, but for now, just know that the Qualic B is the borrower in this transaction. So a quick recap of the parties involved. The investor is going to be a large bank that wants to lower their tax liability and maybe get some community investment, some CRA points. The CDE is the intermediary who brings all the parties together. They're making sure that the community is really benefiting from the investment. And then the Qualic B, they're the entity who has a project in a low-income community in need of funding. Okay. So let's dive into the first player a little bit, the investor, why they're here. The fundamental motivation for the investor is a dollar-for-dollar credit against the federal tax obligation. They earn their credit over a 7-year period, with 5% of the credit taken in the first 3 years and 6% for the next 4. Here we have a simple IRR calculation. An investor paying 81 cents per dollar of credit on a $10 million project would achieve a 7.24% internal rate of return. This is just an example price, but as the price decreases from 81 cents, the investor's return would increase and the benefit to the borrower would decrease. Variables that could push the price higher could be competition with other investors, a credit relationship, geographic footprint, and CRA implications for the investor, as well as the strength of the project itself, which Scott will talk about in a minute. But first, Emma is going to talk about the next key player, the CDEs. Take it away.
Thanks, Margot.
As you all can see, there's many important players in the new market tax credit industry, and one of these key players is the Community Development Entity, or the CDE. I serve as the program manager for the Innovate Fund CDE. We're a CDE that's based in Greenville, South Carolina, but we have projects across a 4-state service area, including South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. The Innovate Fund has been incredibly successful at winning allocations of new market tax credits, in addition to deploying these allocation dollars into projects in low-income communities across our service area. Our track record has been built on projects that focus on 2 main investment priorities. First would be job creation, and second is projects that address health disparities in a community. These investment priorities guide our decision-making process when selecting projects for our pipeline of investments. We rely on regional organizations with similar investment goals to help us identify new projects across the service area and many other partners that we work with. The Innovate Fund, like all CDEs, also has an advisory board, which is made up of new market tax credit professionals and other economic and community development leaders who are boots on the ground across our service area. Currently, 2 of the Innovate Fund's priority pipeline projects were brought to us through advisory board members and their work in the communities, which is just an example of how we can show that it's so important that we have these relationships as a CDE. Now, every CDE is quite different. And now we can talk about the different components that make a strong CDE framework. As Margot mentioned, 107 CDEs across the country were awarded new market tax credit allocation in fall of last year. But there are over 200 active CDEs across the nation, maybe even closer to 300. As I briefly discussed the Innovate Fund's investment priorities, it's important to note that every single CDE has a different investment appetite that depends on everything from the project location to the types of services that project would bring to that low-income community. So let's run through a few examples of what these strategic components might be for a CDE's investment framework. Okay. So first, let's discuss areas of higher distress. We will discuss this in more detail on a future slide, but new market tax credit eligibility is based on census tracts. While the census tracts can either be designated as eligible, severely distressed, or ineligible to receive the new market tax credit allocation, the census tracts can also be representative of an area of higher distress. This list on the slide here just shows many different types of additional distress that low-income communities may demonstrate, whether that's in an Appalachian Regional Commission area, perhaps it's a food desert or a hub zone or a brownfield site. The Innovate Fund, for example, focuses on additional attention on projects that are located in the Appalachian Regional Commission area and promise zones. In addition, we try to get involved with regional advocacy organizations for these areas of distress. For example, we are very involved with the Opportunity Appalachia program, which is a program that's providing additional initial technical assistance capital to projects located in central Appalachian counties that are seeking to support economic restructuring and diversification in underserved communities. So we act as a supporter and a technical assistance provider to these projects in Appalachia. Being a regional participator in Appalachian counties and promise zone communities in our service area not only increases our success in finding projects that matches our investment priorities, but it also allows us to be a go-to for technical assistance for the new market tax credit world in those circles. Track record compatibility is the next key point that we can discuss. CDEs all look for ways to strengthen our new market tax credit applications. And a key way we do this is by building a representative pipeline of projects to discuss in our application that's compatible with projects that we have previously funded in the past. For example, the Innovate Fund has a new market tax credit allocation previously provided to an HIV/AIDS clinic in the past. So we would probably prioritize projects in the future that include support for people living with HIV and AIDS. Maybe a dentist wants to build a new facility that focuses treatment on the people living with HIV and AIDS. Although that project is not exactly the same as the project we previously funded, we could discuss the similarities and the outcomes well enough to consider this project a good comparison to our previous investment. All CDEs look to keep this consistency in their investments. So if you're looking for a CDE that might be interested in your project, perhaps you should start looking into their investment track record to see which CDE might align with the mission of your project. Many CDEs have their impact reports published on their website. And I'll just ask someone in one of our meeting hosts to pop a link to the Innovate Fund's impact report in the chat. You can check out our track record of pipeline projects that we've completed in the past, and perhaps maybe spur some ideas for your own project. Next is job creation. All CDEs will ask the question, how many jobs will your project create in your community? While this is a key decision maker in a project's viability for the Innovate Fund, other CDEs may not focus as heavily on seeing a lot of jobs being created. For example, the Innovate Fund measures job creation by looking for one job to be created for every $50,000 of allocation we provide. Whereas other CDEs may only want to see one job created per every $100,000 of allocation they provide. And they may prioritize other parts of the strategic framework more heavily than the job creation piece. But just know, it is a question we all will ask. Part of job creation is also asking the question, are the jobs being created quality and or accessible? So an accessible job is one that may not require a high school diploma, or it may not require any previous experience of the applicant. Accessible jobs are typically also considered to be targeted to low-income people or people who face barriers to employment, like previously incarcerated applicants. Some projects focus exclusively on accessible job creation targets, while others look to create jobs that are both quality and accessible. A quality job is one that has wages that exceed local living wages. They offer full-time working hours, access to employment benefits, and of course, opportunities for training and advancement. In short, the details of what a quality job is are features that make you like your job probably. So do you feel valued as an employee? Are there resources available to you? Do you have good PTO or time off? And are you earning a stable living? A project that comes to mind immediately when I think of quality and accessible job creation was a manufacturing project that hired people as they left the regional correction facility if they needed a job. Not only were these people leaving incarceration and given an opportunity for immediate employment, but they were also offered additional resources like a housing stipend that could help them transition back into the community. So while some CDEs really prioritize job creation, other CDEs make their bread and butter on community facility projects that have different outcomes. So a CDE may focus on healthcare projects and want to measure the number of patients served by the facility. Perhaps the CDE's focus is on education and they want to measure the number of students looking to take part in the curriculum. Some CDEs really like food bank projects and they measure the amount of food distributed to a community. But overall, CDEs who prioritize community facility projects will be asking the same question of how does this project bring additional services to the low-income community? If you remember the Innovate Fund's second framework for what is a good project for our investment priorities for healthcare projects. So we particularly focus on number of patients served, but we take it a step further and look for regional health outcomes as well, instead of just limited to health outcomes in that census tract. So it's important to note that the new market tax credits are typically the last piece of the funding puzzle. CDEs will prioritize projects that are ready to close on the new market tax credit financing. So these projects typically have to have their environmental studies complete, zoning and building permits in hand, a construction contract in place, complete plans and specs, other sources of financing committed, and everything else that might need to be done to make the project shovel ready. Just because your project may not have all of these pieces in place, however, doesn't mean that you shouldn't reach out to a CDE to discuss your project. I love coming to a project that's early in the stages of development. I'm able to offer the project thoughts on how the new market tax credit may impact other components of their due diligence, like the amount of financing they're able to bring to they need to bring to the table from other sources. And oftentimes, these CDEs are working with projects for multiple years before they actually provide allocation. So don't feel afraid of reaching out early in the process to a CDE that you may have a connection with. We discussed how CDEs must also build a good pipeline of projects for their application. So this is often a great opportunity for deals who are not quite ready to close on the financing to get their foot in the door and begin building a relationship with the CDE. The but-for is a significant piece of the New Market Tax Credit Program. The New Market Tax Credit Program is designed for projects that otherwise would not be able to complete their project without the New Market Tax Credit, and that's what we call the but-for. Oftentimes, the but-for is a financial gap. The project is able to source, 50% of their funding from a commercial bank. They have equity in place for another 25%, and they need the New Market Tax Credit to fill that last piece of funding. Other times, the but-for may be that there are multiple communities competing for the same project, but the New Market Tax Credit made the investment more favorable in that low-income community. CDEs take different approaches to the but-for, so it would be important to discuss your project's but-for really early in your conversations. Underserved state requirements. Every year, 10 states are designated as underserved by the CDFI fund. This designation means that this state has had less New Market Tax Credit investment in comparison to the statewide low-income people population as compared to other states in the country. For the fiscal year 2022 allocation, they're considering the following states as underserved: Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Nevada, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, West Virginia, and Virginia. CDEs may designate a certain percentage of their allocation to underserved states. For example, the Innovate Fund plans to deploy 50% of our allocation to the underserved states of Tennessee and North Carolina if we are successful in receiving an award in the next round. I see a question coming in that I want to pause at before we go to the next section. And that's, can we elaborate on the additional areas of distress criteria? I think it's important to know that there are many New Market Tax Credit mapping tools available online. So they're easy to type in the address of your project and first determine, is your project actually in a community that's designated as eligible for New Market Tax Credits? Eligible and severe distress are both criteria that allow you to receive New Markets allocation there. However, if your project is deemed eligible and not severe distress, oftentimes we're looking to that list of additional areas of distress to find other pieces of why that census tract may be prime for investment. Perhaps it's in a food desert and your project is a grocery store, or perhaps it's a medically underserved area and you're building a health clinic. As we discussed, though, for the Innovate Fund, our additional areas of distress are specific strategies for where we like to put our investments, so promise zones and Appalachian counties. We only have 3 promise zones in our entire 4-state state service area. So we oftentimes see the Appalachian communities as more prime for investment, just since there's so more of them in our service area. But what we're looking for is strategy for that CDE is key for that additional area of distress. And then also it might put your project over the edge if you're addressing some need that area has been designated for as particularly needing. And then last, metro status. CDEs prioritize projects that are located in non-metro, minor metro, or major metro communities. So minor metro communities are those mid-sized cities. You can think Asheville, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, all minor metro areas. Major metro communities are those with more than 1 million people. And it's not just the city itself, it's the metro area surrounding the city. Of course, these cities are New York, Atlanta, Memphis. You can think of all of the largest cities in the country. They're going to hit that major metro box. But CDEs very often prioritize non-metro communities. As you might imagine, finding large $5 million plus development projects in a non-metro community that's prime for New Market Tax Credits is oftentimes more difficult. A lot of times these projects end up being manufacturing projects. However, non-metro and rural are not the same thing. I live in a very rural community, but it's considered to be a minor metro area because it's part of a larger metropolitan statistical area that takes into account perhaps a 1-hour driving radius. So again, if we use these New Market Tax Credit mapping tools available online, you can quickly search if your project site is located in a non-metro community. There are many of these mapping tools that come from different sources, but the one that we use in the closing of a New Market tax credit project is the CDFI fund SIMS mapping tool. And if you just Google that, it'll quickly come up for you to type in your address of your project. Altogether, these criteria make up the unique investment priorities of a CDE. I've put together an example CDE. This one may or may not exist in the world, but the CDE in this example prioritizes projects that are in additional areas of distress. They focus on outcomes for the number of people served, and they look for projects in underserved states. So this CDE may really like a homeless shelter expansion project in Appalachian, Tennessee, that's going to increase the number of people served by 100 people a year. But the CDE may not like a manufacturing project in South Carolina. So just because one project doesn't meet the investment priorities of one CDE, it doesn't mean that it's not prime for investment for another CDE. Okay, poll question number 2. Everybody come to your computer and get ready. So from your organization's perspective, which community impact is most important for community and economic development? So would the organization you work for consider quality job creation opportunities most important, job creation focused on workforce and development and increasing accessibility components of positions most important? Perhaps you all would focus on developing community facilities that provide services to low-income people. Maybe you focus on redeveloping vacant or historic properties. Maybe you're addressing a health concern or education initiatives for youth and adults. I wouldn't say that these are all inclusive. So if you don't feel like your organization is represented here, maybe you can just feel add your vote for what you might be feeling today is maybe the most exciting project. Okay, well, it's a very even split. We've got people who are excited about all of the different types of projects, so that's great. You all have a place in some CDE's heart. Okay, so let's dive into some examples of projects that might be funded with New Market Tax Credits. We've discussed the criteria that many CDEs use when evaluating a project. So now looking at these examples, you can really see how different types of projects are funded every year. All of these projects represent borrowers of either the Innovate Fund or other Cherry Bekaert clients. As you can see, we've got everything from manufacturing to historic rehabilitation, educational facilities, and look, there's even that HIV/AIDS clinic we were discussing before. As you can see from the total allocation size, some of these projects received very, very large investments. The Container Technologies deal, for example, you can see right here it got $17.5 million of allocation. It was a result of 2 CDEs coming together with allocation. The Innovate Fund brought $12.5 million in allocation, and our co-CDE brought in another $5 million. So although it is common for a CDE to fund projects that are in that $5 to $12 million range by themselves without a second CDE, we often see multi-CDE deals with some deals having as many as 5 CDEs in one project. So we definitely see that frequently. Other projects you see here that I'll focus on for a second, Judson Mill in Greenville, South Carolina, that is a historic rehabilitation project. In addition to the New Market Tax Credits, they use the historic tax credits to fund that one. And then we do have a question that came in about projects. Do CDEs typically invest in nonprofits or for-profits? I would say it's an even split, 50-50 between projects that are led by nonprofits or for-profits. We can also invest in projects that are led by special purpose entities of a local government, or any sort of corporation or partnership is eligible for a New Market Tax Credit project. Some CDEs even prioritize more of their investment going to those nonprofit organizations. So you never know, just find the right CDE and what they're looking for in their investment appetite. Okay. So Scott, I'm going to move on to you now. Scott works on our project finance team, which he is key in helping projects that are looking for a New Market Tax Credit allocation find those CDEs, and he's a connector and facilitator of the actual transaction. I know it can sound pretty daunting when I said there's over 200 CDEs active in our country to think, oh my goodness, am I going to have to track down all of them? No, people like Scott exist to help you try to find who can help, which CDE might match what your project is looking for, who has allocation currently, and where the similarities may exist. So Scott, I'll take it away.
Thanks, Emma. Now, Margot and Emma have each kind of walked you through the first two key parts of the New Markets tax credit transaction. I wanted to touch on the one that's the probably the most important in my own selfish world, but it is the Qualic B. If you recall, Margot defined the Qualic B to be the Qualified Active Low-Income Community Business. And to break this down, I'm going to break it into those respective parts. The first one that we're going to review is that qualified active concept. This project needs to be in active conduct of a qualified business. Now, generally, all business activities are acceptable, except the business may not be in what are often referred to as sin businesses. As I describe those, you'll understand maybe why they're called that. The program restricts these proceeds to be used for country clubs, golf courses, massage parlors, hot tub facilities, which I'm still not certain I know what it is, suntan facilities, racetracks, and other gaming facilities, or liquor stores. Additionally, there are prohibitions on businesses that develop or hold intangibles for sale or license. Oftentimes, this would maybe think of like a software or a company that might deal with other kind of nebulous patents. Certain farming businesses, these are restricted because of all the other government subsidies that go to farms. And then residential real estate. Now, I do want to highlight that there is an exclusion to the residential real estate prohibition, and that is for mixed-use projects. And mixed-use projects are defined as projects that derive less than 80% of their gross rental revenue from residential units. I will say, just as a technical rule, because sometimes the technical can be just as important as the practical. This active business must derive at least 50% of its gross income, use at least 40% of its tangible property, and perform at least 40% of its services in low-income communities, or LICs for short. These low-income communities are defined as census tracts, and this gets a little wordy but technical. Census tracts with a poverty rate of at least 20%, or a median family income that does not exceed 80% of the greater of the statewide MFI or the metro area MFI. In addition to these criteria, further attention goes to low-income communities of higher distress. These higher distress low-income communities have a higher poverty rate threshold of 30% and a lower median family income threshold of 60%. They may also have an unemployment rate that is at least 1.5 times the national average, or they are in a non-metro county, as Emma previously highlighted. Additionally, a project can be designated as higher distress, as Emma mentioned, if it meets 2 of the earlier checklist qualifications. I appreciate Emma going into those in more detail. That was a smart question by somebody. In my experience, I'm on the Gulf Coast. And so one of those areas of higher distress is areas that have been, that receive public and private assistance, business and personal assistance from FEMA disaster designation. And so you can understand that there can be some nuance in how to determine how something can qualify, having multiple checks on that checklist. So would certainly tell you that if there's a question about it, to reach out to us. I also wanted to highlight the similarity to what some of you may be familiar with. I think I saw a comment come through earlier that somebody has experience in opportunity zones. So as designed, the Opportunity Zone program was, the states were given the opportunity to designate a certain amount of what are designated as opportunity zones. These opportunity zones are generally, I would say, at least 95% a subset of what is qualified as a low-income community. Now, I say 95% because there was a way to incorporate census tracts that might not be low-income communities if they are contiguous to a low-income community. So states had some override ability in that. I also want to point out here, I'm sure everybody is familiar that there is a census in this country every 10 years. And these qualifications are obviously determined by census data. And that is implemented into the CDFI fund governance every 5 years. Historically, this has lagged about 2 years behind the census that is performed in all years ending in a 0, and the American Communities Survey, which is done in years ending in 5. So we are currently probably, I guess, over 2 years removed from the last census. Typically, we would have implemented those by now. That last census, however, was delayed by COVID. This is kind of a long way of saying what is currently a census tract may not be a census tract when the new information is provided to us. The new markets industry, just as I guess not necessarily a warning, but further insight, the new markets industry expects that change to be soon, but there is uncertainty about when exactly that implementation may occur. So the last letter in our acronym of Qualic B is the business. Now, in the majority of cases, this business will have a project that will spend money on any combination of acquisition, site prep, rehab, new construction, operations, equipment purchases, soft costs. I will kind of reference back to what Margot said earlier, that as a rule of thumb, these projects are typically at least $5 million. I will say that this is mostly a function of economies of scale, where the benefit of the structure needs to outweigh the costs and expenses of closing a new market tax credit transaction. I would say that that threshold, combined with what I mentioned earlier about a certain percentage of tangible property needing to be used in a low-income community, often leads to these structures being used to finance fixed assets and typically heavy equipment, machinery, specially installed items, just because those are not likely to leave a low-income community, which would then negate the Qualic B status as a Qualic B. Some CDEs do, however, often have a set-aside portion as a part of their application, a competitive part of their application, to be used on projects that may have a smaller spend. The structure on those could potentially be different, but in general, you would not be necessarily ruled out by having a project that is too small. It is always important to remember, just think of everything that we have told you thus far. And it's probably easy to understand that the goal of the New Market Tax Credit Program at the end of the day is to finance projects that have an important and measurable community impact. But of additional importance is that that impact needs to be considered within the context of its own community. You may be asking yourself, what exactly does this mean? Now, here's a warning, depending upon your background, this could be a potential bias alert. But let's take a look at these two project examples. The project on the left is in a densely populated downtown area. It has modest job creation and many low-income residents served. It's a mixed-use property being developed by a prepared, experienced developer, but it would not be able to develop the commercial component to provide services to the community and affordable rental units, but for receiving the new market tax credit allocation. The other example is in a more sparsely populated area. This nonprofit educates local kids and operates on predominantly grants and philanthropic gifts. Its reach of 5,000 low-income people covers a larger geographic area than the other project. It has a large capital funding gap, but for these new market tax credits, this project would be unable to reach as many children, or it may have to sacrifice the number of programs that it can offer. Based on what we've learned and a summary of me, Margot, and Emma, each of these businesses can be equally valuable to the right combination of investor and CDE. Now, as most of you know, next question. This is the first session of our New Market Tax Credit virtual series. And we wanted to know which of our next sessions interest you the most. Maddie is dropping the link to the other sessions in the chat. And as a reminder, those sessions are about compliance, reporting, and applications of new market tax credits on May 24th. This session will provide insight into the regulatory aspects associated with new market tax credits and CDEs. The financing capital projects on June 21st will provide insight into navigating the new market tax credit world from a project perspective. And then last, we have the organizations and their next steps in community development. And this will provide insight into organizational strategy on the community development front. You also have the opportunity to to answer all of the above, but unfortunately, there is not an answer for number 1 and number 2, number 1 and number 3, or number 2 and number 3. So either one or all. Let's see. All right. You flattered us. 43%, all of the above. And financing projects. That's good to hear because that's what I'm biased towards. But let's move on. So now that we've hopefully better helped you understand the pieces and parts of the structure, let's walk through simplified, and I emphasize practical example of the structure and economics therein. Our example CDE has submitted an application to the U.S. Treasury based upon its mix of emphasis, as Emma mentioned. It has received $10 million of allocation from the Treasury. Our investor expects to have $3.9 million of tax liability over the next 7 years. For each dollar of credit, that investor is willing to pay 81 cents. This equates to the investor capitalizing our investment for $3,159,000. This investment fund is an entity designed to combine the tax credit equity with those other sources, as Margot mentioned. Now, using basic algebra, we know that in order to make a $10 million qualified equity investment, we need to borrow $6.841 million from a leverage source, as Margot previously mentioned, but worth repeating. This entity may itself be an entity that has aggregated various sources of funds, including private or bank loans, equity, grant proceeds, or fundraising dollars. Now this investment fund has its $10 million. It is able to make its qualified equity investment into a CDE that is a subsidiary of our parent CDE. This QEI is a mechanism that initiates the flow of the tax credits to our investor. Once that investment is made, a clock is started by which the subsidiee has 12 months to make its qualified low-income community investments, or QLICs, into a Qualic B. In the wide majority of cases, these two steps happen the same day. In most cases, CDEs make two loans to the project. That A loan is typically with a principal amount and interest rate reflective of our leveraged loan terms, and a B loan typically in the amount of the equity investment and carrying a nominal interest rate, often at or below 1%. Now, there are closing costs associated with this structure. These costs are largely related to, one, the legal expense of documenting these entities and the various relationships with one another, and two, the annual compliance and audit costs associated with the CDE's continued compliance with program requirements. These costs vary by transaction size and entity structures. A project of this size, $10 million, could see costs as low as $800,000 to more than $1.2 million. For the ease of our illustration, we're going to use an average of those costs and say $1 million. At the end of the 7 years, often what happens is that the project entity or an affiliate thereof will have the ability to acquire all or a portion of that investor's equity for a minimal amount. We see more than a majority of cases, that amount is roughly $1,000. Now, let's look again at these economics in a more basic format. That $10 million of allocation creates a flow of $3.9 million of federal tax credits, for which our investor is willing to pay $3.159 million. This subsidy is first used to cover the cost of that transaction of $1 million. The remaining $2.159 million is spendable cash to the project. So as I hope I've explained clearly, there's a bit of a misnomer in the new markets industry where projects may be confused and think that they have to have a tax liability to engage in a tax credit structure. That is unfortunate, but jargon does what jargon does in the industry. It has left the barn. So unfortunately, it can be a bit confusing. The recipient of that tax credit, as I've hopefully explained, is the investor. And that $2.159 million is actually what the benefit is worth to the borrower. So the most effective way to think of this benefit is think of it as the final 15 to 20% of sources to pair with your already sourced 80 to 85%. This combined financing can allow for more advantageous features like subordination, low effective interest rate, longer interest-only periods, and more often than not, as I mentioned, that ability to purchase your own debt at nominal cost. That's really my summary of the impacts, well, both the structure, but as well as what is important to the Qualic B. So next up, we have, I think, our final question. Would you like further information? Would you like to connect further with Cherry Bekaert to discuss a current or potential new market tax credit project? Our three options are yes, please, maybe later, and not right now. A yes, please answer is an affirmative answer and will likely result in Cherry Bekaert reaching back out to you. Maybe later is a nice way of saying no, and not right now is a less nice way of saying no. Give y'all another second. Let's see the results. Did they already flash? Did we miss them?
Scott, I think we're going to skip over the results on this one and head straight to our final
Sure.
question, final slide here.
Okay, well, if that's the case, I want to thank everyone for their time. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded in order for you to take it home in a doggy bag. Now we wanted to open it up for questions. We have the chat function. We also have the question and answer option here on Zoom. Let's see.
We have one question coming in of what's an example of a smaller CDE from a larger CDE? So really, I guess it would be based on how much allocation you've received. Many CDEs are tied to different parent organizations. A lot of times you'll see a CDE tied to a parent CDFI lender, Community Development Financial Institution lender, or other times you'll see them tied to big banks. So you might consider a big banking CDE like Truist Community Capital's CDE to be a big CDE and the Innovate Fund to be a small CDE. Since we're not tied to a CDFI, we are all we do all day is new market tax credit work. But at the end of the day, we've received $238 million of allocation at the Innovate Fund, whereas maybe some of those banking institutions who have a CDE attached to them may have received less because they've been in the industry for a shorter amount of time. The industry does have some priority for CDEs that are first-time allocatees. So you might see a CDE who's never won any allocation before be successful in applying for new market tax credits simply because they have a track record from other lending that they are now wanting to introduce as a new product for new market tax credits.
Yeah, I'll also add that in order to be granted CDE status, some entities will have, the primary mission to help low-income communities. But CDFIs, which are Community Development Financial Institutions, also kind of categorically are qualified to apply for new market tax credit allocations. These entities are often, small banks or credit unions that primarily serve low-income persons based upon their, historical experience. And so sometimes maybe one of those might initially receive some small amount, effectively the CDFI fund saying, prove it, that you're capable of doing this. And then therein, they got their foot in the door. Now they can build that track record. So I think there was another question as well. I think I covered the one about opportunity zones, but there was a question here from Cindy about moderate income tracts qualify. Not sure what definition of moderate income you're talking, but in general, what is, that definition of a low income community needs to be that either 20% poverty threshold or that 80% MFI. There are other ways that are a bit more nebulous to get that qualification. If you're able to meet that 50% gross income, 40% tangible property, and 40% services provide test to people that you can document as being low income community residents, but you maybe aren't in that low income community. There are ways to get around it, but in general, unfortunately, if you're not in that low income community, then new markets might not be a good fit. That's all to say. I obviously mentioned that census information is about to change. So I would be on the lookout for that. I have noticed in my experience, closed on a rural hospital that was days away from becoming a pumpkin because it no longer would have qualified to be a qualified borrower. So I hope that answers that question. Looked like Jim had a question, but Maggie handled it.
I guess we could just add, Scott, if you do have questions about whether or not your project site is eligible, feel free to shoot any of us an email. We're happy to walk through the process with you or just show you the right mapping tool to look at for future.
Yeah, and here obviously our email addresses attached. And I want to thank everybody again for their time. Hope that you learned something. I hope that we piqued your interest and we'll be hearing from you further. But just in general, I'm really, really grateful for you showing up and learning more about this great tool.